Good evening. My name is Bob Hauser, and I'm the Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to this evening's public program. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. We honor the Lenape community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and engagement activities. In fact, I'm pleased to report that the Mellon Foundation has recently awarded the Society a 5-year renewal and expansion of its support for our Native American Scholars Initiative. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants and fellowships each year, primarily to the younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Most of our nation's founders were early members of the Society. The APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which time he was either vice president or president of the United States. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and other founding members for their key roles in the formation of our nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes, we are most aware of their faults as well, most significantly their slaveholding. In more recent centuries, some APS members were leaders in the invention of so-called scientific racism and in the eugenics movement. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of our institutional legacy while working towards a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. That's the APS idea. Please check our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. While some of our facilities will remain closed for a while, the museum exhibition, Benjamin Franklin, Citizen Scientist, originally scheduled to open in April 2020, will at last open to the public early in August. We're using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type your question in there at any time, and there will be time at the end of the conversation for questions. We're excited to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box at the bottom of the navigation bar of Zoom. It's to the right of the Q&A button. This evening's speaker, Eric Kirschtal, will be introduced by Babak Ashrafi, Director of the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Dr. Ashrafi holds 2 doctorates, one in physics and the other in historical and social studies of science and technology. His research interests include the history of the study of matter and motion in the 19th and 20th centuries and the multiple intellectual and institutional transformations that produced the discipline of modern physics. An elected member of the American Philosophical Society since 2015, Babak's leadership has transformed the consortium from a strictly local undertaking to a leading international enterprise. Dr. Ashrafi uniquely combines the talents of scholar, nonprofit entrepreneur, development officer, and executive administrator, and he's improved productivity prospects for an entire discipline by changing the way that historians of science interact, exchange ideas, and collaborate, and providing new fellowship and grant opportunities for both young scholars and for those engaged in more advanced research. Babak, my friend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. That was very generous. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hello, Eric. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Are you all set?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you just fine.
Okay. I was just having some internet trouble, so I'm hoping that this cellular network will be a little better.
Okay, good. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Hirschall today. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of Utah. And as we will hear, his research focuses on slavery and abolition, on the history of science, medicine, and technology, on African-American history, and the history of the early United States. His first book that we'll be hearing about, The Science of Abolition, How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress, was published earlier this year by Yale University Press. And his research has appeared in a number of leading journals in the field, including Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, the Journal of the Early Republic, and Early American Studies, as well as several edited volumes. His research has been supported by the American Philosophical Society, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Huntington Library, and the McNeil Center at the University of Pennsylvania, among other institutions. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and before that was a journalist. And he continues to write for publications including the New York Times, the New Republic, the Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. So thank you, Eric, for sharing your work with us. If you want to put up your slides and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Because of these internet snafus, unfortunately, I can't. My slides aren't gonna work through the cellular network, but they're not so fancy, so maybe that's okay. But let me just say thank you to everybody who's come out. It's a pretty sizable crowd, which is obviously very humbling. And thank you to the APS for putting this together. As I was just telling Jessica a minute ago, some of the research began very much in the APS collection, looking at Benjamin Rush's paper for an early article as a graduate student that transformed into a piece of the book. William McClure has a prominent role in the book. That's, an APS holds his writings, and Caspar Wistar and a few other figures. So it's a phenomenal collection, and I just want to again thank the APS for making it available to me and to scholars, both professional and amateur historians alike. So what I had planned to do is give a kind of a brief overview of my book today. I had slides, but again, internet issues is going to prevent me from sharing them. So I hope you can bear with me. The talk is titled very similar to what the book is titled, which is The Science of Abolition: How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress. Throughout the summer of 1851, thousands of spectators withstood sweltering heat in London's Hyde Park, waiting to enter the Crystal Palace, an enormous glass structure that had been built for that year's Great Exhibition. A predecessor to the World's Fair, the Great Exhibition functioned as a showcase for the day's most promising scientific inventions. Inventions that the exhibition's promoters thought would offer hope for humanity's future. Britain had abolished slavery 13 years earlier and now positioned itself as the global leader in the international fight against slavery. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the most talked about invention at this year's 1851 exhibition was a new chemical bath machine for flax, a fiber similar to flax, which, as a contrast to cotton. It was this chemical bath machine whose inventors marketed as a technological solution to slavery. If independent farmers in the American Midwest and Ireland cultivated flax, its inventors claimed, this chemical machine would turn flax into a cheaper alternative to slave-grown cotton, effectively putting American slaveholders out of business. Quote, The abolition of slavery will be greatly accelerated by this machine, wrote one of the machine's inventors, one of whom was a chemistry professor at London's Royal Polytechnic Institute. This chemical flax machine won top prize at the Great Exhibition this year. And anti-slavery supporters in the United States, both radical abolitionists and more cautious white anti-slavery moderates, wasted no time in heralding cotton's doom. Quote, "Science is king, not cotton," wrote the New England farmer. "Fugitive slaves should be standing in the front ranks of this experiment," declared Henry Bibb, a fugitive Black leader formerly enslaved in Kentucky, wrote in his British Canada-based newspaper. The chemical machine was, in fact, only one of a much broader array of scientific ideas and technological inventions that British and American scientists, as well as Black and white abolitionists, used to discredit the institution of slavery. From the birth of the organized abolitionist movement in the 1770s and through British emancipation in the 1830s and through the American Civil War, anti-slavery men of science and Black and white abolitionists routinely portrayed slaveholders as scientifically inept and technologically unsophisticated. In short, the enemies of science. And yet this image of slaveholders as the enemies of science tends not to be the first one that we associate regarding the relationship between science and slavery. If anything, historians generally assume that insofar as scientific knowledge mattered in the debates over slavery, it was slaveholders and not abolitionists who dominated the scientific discourse. In this telling, the dominant one, discussions of racial science take center stage, with many believing that slaveholders effectively won the scientific debate, given how common racist racial science was during the entire antebellum period. Yet one of the core arguments of my book is that if we look beyond racial science and instead survey scientific arguments in its broadest sense, from ideas rooted in natural history, botany, and medicine, to technological inventions, geology, and even astronomy, an entirely different picture emerges. Rather than playing mere defense, I argue that abolitionists were in fact far more often on the scientific offensive, and they were particularly successful at wedding the image of science to the cause of abolition. Appreciating abolitionist scientific arguments, or what I call the science of abolition, matters not only because it challenges the common assumption that enslavers, vis-a-vis racial science, dominated the scientific debates surrounding slavery. It matters because scientific arguments played a pivotal role in legitimating the anti-slavery movement, which was particularly important in an era in which science was gaining cultural prestige, and when abolitionists were trying to move beyond the movement's parochial and moral arguments. And secondly, understanding the science of abolition matters because the scientific case against slavery helps explain where the myth of slavery's backwardness comes from. The idea, that is, that slaveholders were hidebound aristocrats and that their institution, slavery, was bound to be defeated by the forces of modernity. In this last regard, my book speaks directly to the new history of slavery and capitalism. Much like the older scholarship on which it's based, these new histories are trying to challenge, and I think rightly, the notion that slavery had little to do with the rise of modern capitalism and closely associated symbols of modernity, namely science and technology. But what rarely goes asked in this new literature, both in its newer forms, I should say, and its original older forms, and what my book in part tries to answer, is where the idea that slavery was backwards comes from in the first place. One of my core arguments, then, is that Black and white abolitionists, along with their scientific allies, were essential to that myth's creation. By marshaling a wide range of scientific arguments, again, rooted in ideas from chemistry, medicine, and botany to technology and geology, these abolitionists and their scientific allies effectively portrayed slaveholders as the enemies of not only science, but of progress itself. and thus as fundamentally backwards. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I'll offer a brief overview of the kinds of scientific arguments that abolitionists in both Britain and the United States, this is a transatlantic project, made against slavery. In the process, I'll highlight one of the core tensions that emerged between radical abolitionists, black and white, and their more moderate white allies in the antebellum, the formal antebellum period, the 1830s onward. Many of whom these moderate anti-slavery allies were recognized men of science. As we'll see, the mere fact that both the radical abolitionists as well as moderate, more mainstream opponents of slavery drew upon scientific ideas to attack slaveholders did not necessarily mean that they deployed these scientific arguments in quite the same way or for quite the same ends. And yet, despite these internal divisions, again, between the radicals and the moderates, what I hope becomes clear is that science was, and perhaps has always been, an essential tool in the struggle for Black freedom. The notion that scientific ideas could be useful in the struggle against slavery dates at least to the Industrial Revolution in late 18th century England. Several members of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was England's first and most prominent abolitionist society, founded in 1787, were prominent men of science. That would include Josiah Wedgwood, best known as a potter who created the Am I Not a Man and a Brother medallion, but who was also lesser appreciated, a chemist and member of the Royal Society, of course, which was the APS was modeled on. It also included this British Abolition Society, Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, as well as Erasmus Darwin, an inventor, botanist, and of course, grandfather to his more famous grandchild, Charles Darwin. These three men were among the first to depict science as a great social equalizer, a force that can help eradicate all social inequalities, slavery chief among them. Quote, this is, quote, the introduction of machines would help gradually eradicate slave labor, Wedgwood wrote in 1788. A few years later, Erasmus Darwin, his close friend, speculated in one of his books, quote, that if sugar could be made from the elements without the assistance of vegetation, and what he's saying here is that if sugar could in effect be made in a test tube rather than grown through agriculture, there might not be a need for slave labor at all. And in 1825, London's anti-slavery monthly reporter and abolitionist journal argued that, quote, in no one instance had slavery and the use of mechanical inventions existed together, echoing, again, Wedgwood's 30 comments from 30 years prior, that slavery, that machines can effectively replace slave labor. Now, these technological and chemical arguments were joined by a host of arguments rooted in natural history. From the founding of Sierra Leone in 1787 through the 1820s, the colony's anti-slavery founders relied extensively on scientifically trained explorers, naturalists, and physicians, as well as Black settlers, to find scientific evidence that might prove to imperial British officials that free Black colonies could be just as commercially successful as enslaved Caribbean colonies. To take just one example, William Allen, a wealthy white British chemist and abolitionist, kept up a decade-long correspondence with Sierra Leone's Black settlers throughout the 1810s, republishing these Black settlers' scientific findings in his anti-slavery pamphlets. Writing privately to James Weiss, a Black settler, in March of 1814, Allen asked whether, and this is a private correspondence, quote, any person in the colony is capable of corresponding with me who has a taste for natural history. Basically, he's asking, hey, do any of the settlers there, many of whom were formerly enslaved Americans who fought for the British, can any of them go on natural history expeditions for me to make the case that this will be commercially viable? Throughout the decade, John Cazell, another Black settler who won his freedom as a Black loyalist fighting for the British during America's War of Independence, actually did just what Allen was asking for, and sent Allen several letters detailing his own expeditions into the West African interior and providing updates on the colony's botanical experiments, in addition to sending him, and just one small quote, 3 specimens of medicine that I hope you will accept as from a friend. To switch to the American side. For American abolitionists, scientific ideas played an equally prominent role. 3 of the first 4 presidents of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the new American nation's leading abolitionist society, were prominent men of science, one of whom, of course, was Benjamin Franklin, and another, Benjamin Rush. A third was Caspar Wistar, and I mentioned that third only because they were all APS members. Several decades later, Benjamin Silliman, Yale's first chemistry professor, a leading scientific thinker in the early republic, and a member of the New Haven's Anti-Slavery Society, wrote a report for the federal government which argued that the institution of slavery was preventing Louisiana sugar planters from investing in more profitable and labor-saving technologies. Quote, the account given nearly 40 years ago by Brian Edwards, the celebrated planter and historian of the West Indies, Silliman wrote, is substantially a statement of what happens to this hour. Basically, he was telling the federal government in a slightly more subtle way that Louisiana planters' refusal to adopt new technologies that slavery was preventing Louisiana planters from adopting new technology that would help them get rid of slave labor. The relationship between anti-slavery men of science, most of them white male elites, and abolitionist societies changed dramatically in the antebellum period, or roughly between the 1830s and the onset of the Civil War. Before the 1830s, men of science were prominent figures both in American and British abolitionist societies. But in the 1830s and onward, as anti-slavery momentum stalled and a series of slave rebellions shook the Atlantic world, abolitionist societies, especially in the United States, became more radical, increasingly led or co-led, I should say, by free Black Americans like Frederick Douglass and white radicals like William Lloyd Garrison. These, what Manisha Sinha calls second wave abolitionist societies, rejected the earlier movement's gradualism and their skittishness about actually engaging or defending the idea of Black citizenship. Instead, these new second wave abolition societies demanded the immediate uncompensated end to slavery as well as full Black citizenship. As abolitionism became more radical and less, I would add, respectable, men of science increasingly kept their distance. And yet, this is what I want to highlight, many white Northern men of science remain adamantly opposed to slavery. And along with their more radical abolitionist sort of fitful allies, all of these groups, anti-slavery moderates and radicals, continued to press the scientific case against slavery. One of the more common scientific arguments made by both anti-slavery men of science, moderate anti-slavery men of science, as well as radical abolitionists, Black and white, during this period related to new technologies. Echoing Wedgwood and Benjamin Silliman, moderates and radicals argue that new technological inventions like that chemical machine that I opened this talk with would sooner or later make slave labor obsolete. The Scientific American, still around today, a popular scientific magazine based in New York, gave this specific chemical machine, which was covered in newspapers from America to London, gave it its full vote of approval, calling it a very philosophical idea. Horace Greeley, the white anti-slavery editor of the United States' largest newspaper in the 1950s, the New York Tribune, wrote several columns praising this chemical machine, writing that it all but assured slavery's destruction. And this is probably my favorite quote in the whole book. Greeley wrote on accounts of this chemical machine, perhaps South Carolina would secede from chemistry, as well as from the Union of Common Sense. But here is where things get interesting. Unlike radical abolitionists, white anti-slavery moderates, by far more numerous than radical Black and white abolitionists, often position scientific solutions to slavery, like the flax machine, as a kind of anti-politics. That is, as a way to avoid sectional conflict by arguing that technological solutions would eventually make slavery unnecessary. In other words, moderate anti-slavery voices argued that it was better to wait for a technological fix to slavery rather than engage in divisive and possibly violent political agitation against slavery, like radical abolitionists and radical Republicans were doing. As one more moderate anti-slavery Boston newspaper wrote in 1861, a few months before the Civil War, it wrote, quote, "The genius who discovers a flax substitute for cotton would, quote, do more for the abolition of slavery than 1,000 abolitionist senators combined." In other words, again, let's hold off the war and let's wait for scientists to find a scientific solution to slavery. So how did radical abolitionists, especially Black abolitionists, which I want to focus on, respond to this co-option of scientific ideas by these more moderate, and I would argue more mainstream, not I would argue, and as a matter of fact, more mainstream anti-slavery voices? Perhaps surprisingly, many Black abolitionists, despite their own internal divisions, chose to embrace many of these same scientific arguments. It was, to quote Frederick Douglass in 1854, an age of science. And Black abolitionists could either turn away from science and risk being seen as against modernity, exactly the opposite image anti-slavery leaders had been generating since the movement's inception, or they could engage with these scientific arguments and shape them to their own ends. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, in fact, reported on the chemical flax machine weeks before Greeley's New York Tribune did. And Douglass continued to report on later versions of this machine throughout the 1850s, long after Greeley had stopped. Douglass also touted other scientific advances that also he believed held anti-slavery potential, including a report in a chemical journal reported by the revered German chemist Justin von Liebig, who claimed that asparagus had more caffeine content than coffee. And to Douglass used the scientific evidence to report in his own paper that maybe in cooler climates where asparagus grew a little better, that if farmers grew asparagus, they could put economic pressure on Cuban and Brazilian coffee slave plantation owners. So why did Black abolitionists embrace many of these scientific ideas, particularly in light of its co-option by these more moderate anti-slavery voices? Well, I argue that they did so for a number of reasons. First, embracing scientific ideas was a way to keep more moderate mainstream white Northerners within the broader anti-slavery camp that was building in the North, given the popular appeal of science in this particular moment. Second, the chemical flax machine in particular could help the boycott movement against slave-grown cotton, which Black abolitionists had revived in the 1840s. Third, and perhaps most importantly, free Black communities in the North often promoted scientific ideas and scientific education because they believed that it would help them. It would help make them press the case that they would be useful citizens. To embrace science for many free Black Northerners, in other words, was another way of making a claim on citizenship. Quote, "Where can we find among ourselves men of science? Where are our lecturers in natural history, our critics in useful knowledge?" said Mariah W. Stewart, a Black educator and activist, to an all-Black Boston audience in 1833. In other words, she was pressing Black audience to embrace science for their own sort of practical and political purposes. To be sure, not all radical abolitionists embraced scientific arguments. Throughout the 1850s, William Lloyd Garrison, the radical white abolitionist leader, routinely denounced scientific arguments against slavery, be they ones pointing to steam engines or chemical flax machines. The core of Garrison's argument was that slaveholders kept their slaves not for the money, but for the power. Therefore, to Garrison, scientific solutions, which often, particularly these technological ones, often based on the idea that they would exert economic pressure on slaveholders, to Garrison's mind, were destined to fail. As he wrote, "It's not profit that makes slavery so devilish, but man's love of power." No amount of financial pressure could convince a slaveholder to embrace abolition, he believed. In his mind, they needed a moral reckoning. Garrison, I would concede, may have had a point. In other words, slavery was not just about money, it was about power. But I would argue that he also had the luxury of moral purity, something that most Black abolitionists had lacked. Many Black leaders had family and friends who were still enslaved, and unlike Garrison, they felt the daily ostracism that came with being Black in America, a humiliation many Black leaders believed would not lessen so long as slavery remained intact. And never in the nation's history had so many white Northerners expressed, at the very least, a basic disdain for slavery. By embracing scientific arguments then, even when they supported or were being used to support a more tepid political agenda, like many white moderates, which ultimately, of course, congeals in the Republican Party, radical abolitionists were not, I would argue, they were not compromising on their principles by embracing these scientific arguments. Rather, they were shaping their message in a way that white moderates could understand. After all, it was mainstream moderate anti-slavery political parties like the Republican Party that radical abolitionists would use to push through a more radical agenda. For Black abolitionists, embracing scientific ideas functioned in much the same way. They were essentially vehicles for a more radical agenda. Black abolitionists may or may not have believed that scientific ideas held the keys to emancipation, but they understood that many white moderates did or wanted to believe it, and Black abolitionists needed their support. If that meant promoting scientific solutions to achieve their more radical goals, so be it. It was true that scientific ideas were used by both white anti-slavery moderates and slavery's defenders to ends that were antithetical to true Black freedom. But Black abolitionists and their allies never rejected the importance of science to their movement. Science, these abolitionists understood, was power. And with the power that scientific ideas gave their movement, they would set about making enslaved people free. And that concludes my talk.
That's terrific. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
So folks would put their questions in the Q&A. The button is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I see hands raised. I don't believe we're set up to call on people who've raised their hands. So Eric, as folks are gathering their thoughts, I really enjoyed reading your book. And one question that I had about it was the many ways that people use the word science. Mm-hmm. And two of the ways were producing scientific knowledge, mm-hmm. Whether it's anatomy or new technologies or the environmentalism that would explain racial difference. The other way was as an appeal to trust, to authority, that most people aren't producing new scientific knowledge, but they trust some authority. They trust some mm-hmm. institutions, some people, some scientific circles. And I wonder if there was a difference, and that's, I think, what most of the things that you described are. So the effort by abolitionists to present slaveholders as anti-modern and anti-scientific or non-scientific was to strip them of the authority, of the cultural authority they might have gotten from science. So I was wondering if you saw a difference in those uses of science between the two groups. And it's not something that your book focuses on. You talk a lot about the scientific authority of abolitionists, but what were the cultural authorities, the institutional authorities that were contra the abolitionists? And how was that argument played out?
So I will admit that my book focuses. I really wanted to do a deep dive on abolitionists, and when there was a clear debate between something that I saw, okay, this is clearly bigger than just what abolition is saying. How are slaveholders responding? That's when the slaveholders' point of view. But I wasn't necessarily so interested in the debates themselves, and just what was the arsenal, the ways in which abolitionists were drawing on, yes, the many abolitionists who were, legitimate, and I use that in quotation marks, APS members. How are they relying on these kind of intellectual authorities, as well as how are they just drawing on maybe scientific knowledge or scientific ideas that was published in the Philosophical Transactions, or new inventions that had the hecture, the approval of scientific authorities like this flax machine. How are they using that to bolster their case? All of that is a way of saying I don't have a full grasp of how slaveholders were responding. But what I do have a full grasp of, because you cannot avoid it, is the ways in which slaveholders were using racial science, right? And this is where it gets actually quite interesting. And if people, if you start reading my book, I mean, it's clear that I have a deep discomfort with the way, and I think anybody, reading these days would, the ways in which anti-slavery intellectuals or scientific, people with scientific respect, namely Benjamin Rush, a key figure in my book, the way that they are using science to discount or discredit the kind of racist, pro-slavery racial science that we're seeing emerge at the end of the 18th century. The idea, essentially, that Black people in one way or another are mentally or physically inferior, or maybe physically well-suited for slavery, mentally inferior, therefore not fit for freedom. And in that sense, yes, scientific figures have a very strong case, and they're also, I would argue, maybe even aided by white anti-slavery scientific elites who are, adopting many of the same kind of cultural assumptions or scientific assumptions. And just to give one example, Benjamin Rush, I wrote a separate paper for this that kind of got this book started, right? He's using racial science to attack slavery. He makes interesting arguments that are really about medicine, not so much about, evolution or ideas about racial evolution. But when it comes to the idea, what is his assumption about human difference? His assumption is that all bodies are naturally white, that all people, revert to whiteness. And his main attack, and this is the irony of it, he's basically attacking Jefferson and all of these kind of pro-slavery scientific thinkers who are beginning to articulate publicly their scientific view about Black inferiority. He's saying, no, actually, all of the things that you say are bad or that make Black people inferior, particularly physical features, darker skin, hair tones, all this is symptoms. This is Benjamin Rush. And he's saying, this is an anti-slavery argument. He's saying this is, these things are, these physical characteristics are symptoms of an ancient disease, and they're not contagious, but they're ultimately an ancient disease, and they're basically the vestigial representation of a disease. And if you ultimately free Black people and put them in a healthy environment as free farmers, fresh air, not cabins and all the dirty, unhealthy environments of slavery, they will gradually over time turns white. So in this argument, you see how, the problem with racial science is that even though at least the white anti-slavery science who are engaging in it are also playing into deep anti-Black assumptions, even if they're using that for anti-slavery ends. So what I want to do is to shift the focus and see all these what's been, even that Rush case in little paragraphs has been discussed before. I wanted to shift the focus to get to all these other things that don't have to do with racial science.
Good. So we have two questions, one from an anonymous attendee and one from Patrick Sparrow, who'd like to know how you got interested in this topic and how your thinking has changed between the time you were working on it at the beginning of your dissertation and now that your book is out.
The two wonderful questions. Well, I'll start with the first one. How did I get interested in this project? At a graduate seminar, one of our early research papers, Eric Foner was leading this, research seminar, and I was really interested in these two worlds of science and slavery. And I came across Benjamin Rush's. To scholars who study this period and study this topic, they will know what I'm talking about, Benjamin Rush. But he gives this famous speech, again, saying that, freeing Black people will free them of their Blackness. It boggled my mind. I mean, I was not prepared to encounter, reading through the digitized APS arguments, an argument that was actually saying that blackness is unhealthy, but ultimately it's slavery that's, not causing it, but keeping them black. And this was actually that APS, that journal article, and then kind of who was this guy, this Rush guy, and I found out how important his was. I mean, I knew nothing, about science in this period 7-8 years ago. That was the genesis. But quickly, I began to realize that so much is written about racial science that I didn't want to add a little permutation there, that I wanted to find something new. And as I expanded my purview beyond questions of, what was called ethnology by the 10s and 20s, I was finding all this, a much more vast array, what scientists represent, what science meant at the time, natural history, botany, all these other things, chemistry, and there was much uncovered ground that I can protect and tap. And the second thing, what I would do differently, I don't know exactly how I would do it differently, but I think this project started, I had a very, you can say, old-fashioned view of scientific knowledge that I focused too much on scientific elites. One of the great sort of developments in the last 10 years in the history of science is really, indigenous forms of knowledge. That's not now. So I engage a little bit with this in my Sierra Leone chapter, seeing how all these white, recognized scientists, some of them trained under Linnaeus, are going, and Joseph Banks, the kind of scientific, the Einsteins of their day. But they're relying on, and when I say indigenous, I really mean West African people who live there, and they're asking them for information. So I would have flipped the script a little bit more and really centered more of the indigenous Africans if I was there. I mean, again, it's there, in my view, not enough. And similarly, although I'm not exactly sure how I would do it, African Americans. I mean, you saw in my final chapters, when there's a free Black community, it was easy because then Black people are starting to publish stuff, and that's very easy to access, easier stuff to access. But there would have been more creative ways to show perhaps the ways in which enslaved people, enslaved Black people in America, to say nothing of kind of less elite Black figures, people who, couldn't write, the ways in which they were engaging with scientific knowledge on a more kind of local level in the North. I definitely would have had more of that. Again, not that it's not in my book, but to my mind, it's not enough in my book.
David, excuse me. David Kent would like to know whether Abraham Lincoln was aware of scientific arguments for or against slavery.
Absolutely. One thing I had to cut, there's a wonderful book, I'm forgetting who wrote it, Abraham Lincoln, scientific inventor. And it's really exploring, the 1840s and onward. This is when the railroad is really taking off. I mean, steam engines have been around for a couple of decades, but, they're only expanding, ever more so. So all these new kind of technological inventions are very closely associated, like now, with science. I mean, when we think of, the tech industry, we don't kind of naturally, we realize that this is obviously it's applied science, but is nonetheless part of the scientific world. Similarly, these major inventions have a tremendous, very material effect on lives. I mean, all of us know about, the market revolution, if you study the antebellum period, right? I mean, rapidly bringing, reorientating markets, helping, farmers get good, and slaveholders, quickly ship things across the Atlantic, up and across America with all these railroads. Abraham Lincoln, frankly, like most people, are fascinated, just like we are today with, the digital revolution. They're fascinated with technologies on account of these major technologies. So Abraham Lincoln, for example, I'm forgetting exactly, there's one thing that I had to cut from the book, but amidst the Civil War, he's basically saying, how are we going to, rebuild the economy after slavery is possibly destroyed? And he's writing about, new technology, in a way, technology is replacing slave labor. And one can also make the argument. So in that sense, right, we see Abraham Lincoln kind of thinking about, new technologies as helping alleviate the stress that will come from whatever the consequences will be of ending slavery. Similarly, you are seeing simply during the war years itself. I mean, it's a larger argument. It's not as tight, but one can see Abraham Lincoln and Congress during the Civil War years are deeply invested they're relying on scientists to help them with the war effort. And insofar as the Civil War after 1863 becomes not a war for union, but a war, an abolition war. That is to say, a war to keep the union intact and end slavery. The war, all the technologies that are aiding the war effort could be read as a way of using technology to literally engage in a war against slavery. Again, that's a little bit removed, a more of a strained argument. But clearly, Abraham Lincoln is a huge fan of technology. And I believe he has several patents under his name, not regarding slavery, but, tinkering was very common amongst, figures like him.
So Bob Hauser has a question about technology, which is, how does the cotton gin fit into this argument? It was a major technological invention. Wasn't it accepted by slaveholders, but
Absolutely.
did it actually increase the demand for slave labor? So how does that fit into this picture?
So that's a perfect question. And one can add to that the steam engine, right? I mean, the steam engine, in terms of transportation, I think it's Walter Johnson in River of Dark Dreams, points to the number, nobody had more steam engines in the United States than Southern slaveholders going up and down the Mississippi River. So clearly, this is how I frame it in my book, clearly in a material sense, undeniably, and this is all the slavery and capitalism stuff, which often has a technological element embedded in that scholarship, they're showing that actually technology fuels slavery's expansion. And that's absolutely true. The question that my book ultimately says is, well, then why are they not perceived by the 18? I mean, really, I would argue for much of the period, except when it comes to racial science, they're not seen as being technologically or scientifically sophisticated, despite the fact that technologies are clearly aiding them. And this is why my book is really centered on these arguments, on basically discourse. And clearly, in the realm of in the discursive realm, in the realm of arguments that make it on paper, it is abolitionists who are on the attack. And this idea that slavery prevents inventions is widespread. I mean, so widespread that when the British Parliament is debating ending slavery in the early 1830s, the comments that you hear throughout the transcript of these discussions are, Caribbean planters are so backwards. They're not adopting new steam engines. They're not adopting plows, which were seen as a more modern thing than hoes. Which is another kind of technology or scientific agriculture. And the argument, and this is where the debate does come in. What are planters saying? They're not making the case otherwise. They're not saying no. Look, we are very modern. They can't deny the fact that on certain technologies like the hoe versus the plow, they don't have the modern plow. And they can't deny also the other major thing that you see is, of course, exhausting the soil. So many northern planters in an era 1830s, 40s of agricultural chemistry, they're arguing, look, why don't you guys adopt ways, scientific agriculture to revitalize your soil. And slaveholders don't have a good argument. Their only argument is expand westward. Or they're saying that we're trying, it's not working. But it seemed clear to me that when it came to, again, these technologies, these chemical things, in terms of the arguments, it was abolitionists who were really on the offensive. And slaveholders, aside from racial science, really didn't have a strong argument in their case despite, of course, as Bob Hauser rightly points out, they were materially benefited from science, no question.
So one of our attendees wants to know about the sources that you used. Where do you find information about scientific uses and scientific arguments among abolitionists?
So it's a wonderful question. My initial impulse, and this is why the APS was so important early on, was to go to places like the APS or Yale. Benjamin Silliman is this, I believe he's a member of APS, but he's Benjamin Silliman, again, that Yale professor. He trains briefly under Benjamin Rush, actually at UPenn Med School. He's not a physician, but he learns chemistry from Benjamin Rush, takes just kind of elective classes sort of thing in the early 1800s. So my initial strategy was, okay, how am I going to approach this? These are people. I want to tell a story that centers people. So let me find the people who were card-carrying abolitionists. Again, that changes form, as you saw from the before the 1830s, after the 1830s. But it's clear that particularly in this early period, many of these card-carrying abolitionists, by that I mean members of one of the many northern anti-slavery societies, are members of the APS, are physicians teaching at medical schools, are Benjamin Silliman, 1804, 1802 or 4, I forget, the first chemistry professor, its own chair. So find those figures and then read their public and private papers. So that was strategy number one. And that's why if you read my book, you will see every chapter has 3 or more really scientists who were deeply involved with the abolitionist movement at some point, and reading how they're drawing on their own scientific knowledge expertise and applying it to their anti-slavery arguments. And then the second strategy, particularly, again, this is when I really wanted to focus on these Black voices who, because they were Black and no other reason, they weren't allowed to join, or whether formally or just by default, weren't allowed to become members of the APS or the library company, or certainly any medical education. How were Black abolitionists particularly, and this becomes easier in the 1830s on, how were they using scientific arguments or drawing on scientific authority to bring that knowledge into their argument? So therefore, my sources became, for these Black abolitionists, Black newspapers, the papers of Frederick Douglass, the papers of Martin Delany, one of the few Harvard-educated medical school in the 1850s, looking at their papers and seeing what they're saying. So that was my, the core of my research base. And then I went a little bit into congressional records and parliament records to see, how far did these arguments go? Were they deployed when politicians were debating the end of slavery? And certainly in 1833, they were not the only arguments, of course, but they were certainly relevant, particularly the idea that slaveholders are backwards and slavery is preventing them from adopting labor-saving technologies.
So we have a question about the authority of science and the truth of scientific claims, which is that appeals to science and experiment and observation have long been used to maintain exploitative systems. So it's perhaps a little bit later than the period of your book, but what did you find out at the moment where bad science is exposed as such? And are there pivotal moments, or do these oppressive scientific systems just fade away?
They certainly do fade away. I mean, they're still with us. Once we start getting away from, this is what I think not to get too, it's not off topic. I mean, this is why thinking about systemic racism is so important, right? I mean, it's not today. I mean, it's not necessarily, and even then, I mean, I think Benjamin Rush illustrates the problem. How do these good guys use science in a way that, on the one hand, is meant to end slavery, but clearly replicates, in other words, his intention isn't to prolong slavery or anti-Black racism, his intent to end slavery, but he makes the case by assuming that Blackness is somehow unnatural. So these types of, deep embedded assumptions and the ways in which they're widespread amongst, white elites for and against slavery when it comes to race are very much there. And frankly, they're still with us today. Assumptions about, innate difference and why, emphasizing, we're so quick to go to genes, not forget the fact that, the social and environment explanation, evidence that we have, root causes of racial disparities in America health-wise are so strong. We're fascinated by race then and now, and science will naturally reflect that, even if it's sometimes today, right? I mean, I'm thinking about Vital, the drug, right? I mean, the argument was that, based off of, many would argue, suspect science, but, Black people are responding better to this heart drug. I believe it's heart, I'm forgetting now. And therefore we should, racially target medicine. Obviously a deeply problematic and so we're still seeing this, good people can do bad science too. It's not just the slaveholders. I'm getting off topic there, just to get back to the main point, which I'm blocking on what the thrust of that. Let me just say this. Let me just say this in regarding, bad science. The one thing I want to do, and this is speaking to many of, I hope some people who are historians of science in the academic world. I mean, something that we do, and I think it's good, is question the authority, the truth, the objectivity of science, and show in a way how much human subjectivity is embedded in the creation of scientific knowledge. I mean, that is the kind of dominant mode of academic historians of science since at least the 1970s. And one of the things that I want to show is challenge that a little bit, which is not to say, to show that science, particularly in the hands of abolitionists, including Black abolitionists, was also not bad, but was also used as a source of liberation. the point isn't to stop investigating the ways in which social biases are embedded in scientific knowledge. The point is to remind us, particularly the historians of science among us, that science also has a history of being mobilized in some of our most important moral and good moral struggles in Western history, including the abolitionist movement. And I think that is a powerful message that I think, I want certainly the public to take, and I hope maybe historians of science may consider as we go about showing all the racism and science as a tool of oppression narrative, which is undeniably true.
So I was going to end by asking you to read the last paragraph of your conclusion, but I think we've run out of time. But if anyone gets the book, I really encourage you to read it and to make sure you read the last paragraph of the last page 252, because it's a terrific summary of your point of view that you take away about science. And on the point of when racial science or racist science turned, folks might be interested in a podcast series where we address that question, which goes on the period after Eric's book through the mid-20th century is when a consensus formed that racial science was not right. In particular, an episode with John Jackson and another one by Sebastian Gil Riaño. And that's on chstm.org, a series on the history of racial science. Well, we have more questions, but I was told to stop at about 7. So thank you very much. It's a terrific book and a terrific talk, and I really enjoyed reading it. The book is The Science of Abolition, How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress, out from Yale University Press just about now. And I see Jessica has put the link in the chat. Thank you, Eric.
And thank you so much. And thank you, everybody at the APS and all those wonderful participants who stuck it out for this hour. I really appreciate it.
All righty. Have a good night, everyone. Please join us. Check the APS website for the next online event, and hoping to see you there. Take care.